Imam Al-Ghazali's 6 principles of selling stand as a profound window into his deeply moral vision of economic life, where trade is not simply an exchange of goods, but a spiritual act shaped by intention, fairness, compassion, and responsibility towards society and the Creator. And when we explore these 6 principles, we begin to understand how he stitched the entire fabric of commerce into the larger garment of ethics and the human soul, because for Al-Ghazali, every coin passed from one hand to another carries with it the weight of accountability in this world and the next, and so his teachings stand not merely as medieval Islamic legal guidance, but as a timeless framework for anyone who seeks to earn with dignity, spend with mindfulness, and engage in markets without letting greed fracture the delicate balance between material desire and divine command. And the first principle he emphasizes is truthfulness in every transaction, because Al-Ghazali believed that lying in business is not simply a moral flaw, but an assault on the trust that holds civilizations together. And in his writings he repeatedly warned that when sellers exaggerate, hide defects, manipulate appearances, or misrepresent quality, they slowly corrode the foundation of society, just like rust that eats iron from within. And for him, truthfulness was not only about words, but also about attitudes and intentions, because a merchant who speaks the truth but intends deception is still spiritually corrupt, and thus he demanded that anyone who sells anything must present it as it is, without disguise or misleading words. And he describes the honest merchant as someone who sleeps peacefully at night, because he knows that no soul will rise against him on the day of judgment claiming injustice. And this moves smoothly into his second principle, which is avoiding exploitation of buyers, especially those who lack knowledge, experience, or bargaining power, because Al-Ghazali saw trade as an arena where human weaknesses are exposed, and he insisted that a moral merchant does not take advantage of these weaknesses, even when he easily can. And so he condemned overpricing to the point of oppression, manipulating the inexperienced buyers, using emotional pressure, exploiting people during scarcity, or pretending that a worthless item is precious. And he explains that the true test of character is not in being fair when you have no choice but being fair, when you have every opportunity to cheat and get away with it. And he wrote that a seller who overcharges a poor man for essential goods is not merely unjust but spiritually diseased, because he places profit above human need and compassion. And so he instructs sellers to imagine standing before God with the buyer next to them, repeating the exact conversation they had at the marketplace, and then ask themselves whether they would still feel proud of their words and actions. And this moral imagination is one of Al-Ghazali's most powerful educational tools, because it forces a trader to measure his actions not by market norms, but by divine standards. And then comes the third principle, which is disclosing hidden defects, because Al-Ghazali taught that God may forgive many sins, but deception through concealment of flaws is among the most dangerous, because it destroys trust, creates resentment, and spreads corruption. And he recounts several stories from early scholars where merchants were punished in spiritual terms for hiding defects, even if the defect was small. Because for him deceit is deceit no matter the size, and he describes the seller who conceals a flaw as someone who steals not with his hands, but with his silence. And he argued that even if the buyer does not discover the defect in this life, it will stand as a witness against the seller in the next life. And so he insisted that every merchant must speak candidly about anything that reduces the value of the item, even if it drives the buyer away, because the purpose of trade is not to lure customers, but to serve them through fairness and transparency. And with this principle, he takes trade out of the arena of manipulation and places it firmly into the realm of moral service. And then comes the fourth principle, which is avoiding excessive praise and manipulative marketing tactics, because Al-Ghazali lived in a time when merchants shouted exaggerated praises in the market, trying to emotionally influence buyers, and he criticized this practice strongly, saying that a seller who praises his product beyond its reality not only misleads the buyer, but also misleads himself into believing that material gain is the highest achievement. And he warned that such merchants become addicted to psychological manipulation, forgetting that every moment of their speech is being recorded by angels. And so he taught that a seller should describe his product simply, honestly, and without theatrical language, because the purpose is not to trick the buyer into desire, but to provide clarity so the buyer can make an informed decision. And he explains that God blesses the earnings that come without manipulation, but removes blessing from money earned through exaggeration and deceit, and that a single coin earned through honesty is heavier in divine scales than mountains of wealth earned through manipulation and praising goods beyond reality. And then we reach the fifth principle, which is being fair in pricing and resisting the greed that distorts market ethics, because Al-Ghazali understood that commerce is a natural part of life, and that profit is not only allowed but necessary, but he warned that when profit becomes limitless desire, the soul becomes enslaved and society becomes unhealthy. And so he taught that a fair price is one that does not oppress the buyer nor harm the seller, but rather sits in the middle ground of mutual benefit and sustainable exchange, and he condemned merchants who purposely create artificial scarcity, hoard goods to inflate prices, or exploit times of crisis for personal gain, because he believed that such behavior turns commerce into cruelty and transforms markets into arenas of suffering, and he repeatedly reminded merchants that the Prophet himself encouraged moderation and forbade price manipulation, and so Al-Ghazali urged traders to be generous when the community is struggling, to reduce their margins when the poor are in need, and to remember that every price tag carries a moral dimension, and he describes wealth as a river that flows, but warns that when a merchant blocks the river to store all the water for himself, he starves the land around him and brings divine displeasure upon his fortunes. And finally, the sixth principle is maintaining spiritual awareness while engaging in worldly trade, because Al-Ghazali never saw commerce as separate from worship, but rather as a continuous opportunity to serve God through honesty, patience, humility, and compassion. And he argued that a merchant who remembers God while buying and selling will never harm a customer, because his conscience becomes his companion and guardian. And he said that intention is the heart of trade, and that the moral value of a transaction lies not merely in its legal form, but in the motives behind it. And so he taught that a merchant must purify his intention before every sale, reminding himself that he earns not only for his body but for his soul and for the well-being of society around him, and that wealth earned ethically becomes a light in his life, but wealth earned through injustice becomes darkness, no matter how much it increases. And he encouraged merchants to give charity regularly, to soften their hearts, to forgive debts when possible, to show kindness in bargaining, and to treat buyers not as sources of profit, but as fellow humans seeking benefit in a shared world. And he warned that wealth has a powerful ability to blind the heart if not controlled, and that the cure for this blindness is constant self-examination, remembering death, remembering accountability, remembering that every coin earned unjustly becomes a burden, while every coin earned ethically becomes a wing that lifts the soul. And in combining all six principles, Al-Ghazali presents a vision of commerce where morality is more important than margins, where compassion is more important than competition, where the marketplace becomes not a battlefield of greed, but a field of spiritual cultivation. And he reminds us that economic life shapes society profoundly, and that a merchant can either uplift a community through fairness or poison it through deception. And he believed that ethical trade strengthens families, reduces conflict, supports justice, and spreads trust across generations. And so in his great works he urged Muslims to rise above greed and make trade a means of character purification and social harmony, rather than a tool for selfish gain. And when we look at the modern world full of inflated promises, hidden defects, manipulative advertising, overpriced essentials, and economic exploitation, we find that Al-Ghazali's six principles are not ancient ideas frozen in history, but powerful solutions for the moral crises of our time, because he gives us a code of conduct that aligns economic action with human dignity, spiritual purpose, and social welfare. And when applied today, these principles can heal marketplaces, rebuild trust, and remind sellers and buyers alike that commerce is not merely the exchange of goods, but the exchange of conscience and character. And so his teachings continue to echo across centuries, urging us to restore ethics to the heart of our financial lives, because in the end wealth will vanish, possessions will fade, accounts will close, and only the honesty we practiced, the fairness we upheld, the compassion we showed, and the justice we pursued will stand beside us on the day when every transaction will be examined with perfect truth.